First thing I want to do is thank you all for joining us. So welcome to our webinar tonight. We're excited to be talking about knives with Chef Chris Parker from Mercer Culinary. Before I officially introduce him and turn it over to him, just a couple housekeeping notes. So if you have any questions today, feel free to throw them in the chat box. Feel free to put any questions that you might have in the Q&A box as well. We're happy to talk through any questions that you might have. And then also we do have a survey that will launch at the end of tonight's webinar. Please do fill that out. It has some good insights that we would love to hear from you about, what else we can do better to market emails, to, talk about FCS things. And then also we are recording tonight. So just be aware that we are recording this webinar, and we'll be sending out a link to the folks who can't make it live. And there will be some handouts too that we will be following up with and providing. So without any further ado, I want to officially introduce Chef Chris Parker, and he has been the sales director and corporate chef for Mercer Culinary since 2012. Prior to joining Mercer, he worked in a restaurant in New York City and his hometown of Cincinnati. He graduated from the Midwest Culinary Institute at Cincinnati State. So Chris, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you all tonight. Thank you for making time. I know that we all have busy evenings and busy lives, or afternoons if you're on the West Coast. So truly thank you very much for joining us today. And we will get started now. So what we're talking about tonight is primarily want to talk more about knives and sharpening, honing, the different processes that we use to keep our tools sharp. That's the focus of tonight's conversation. So I'm going to do a deep dive into the different tools that exist to keep your cutlery sharp, so that you can make sure that your students in your classrooms have the best tools in the best shape, so that the cuts are clean and straight. We can minimize our injuries and make sure that the students are learning how to cut and fashion food properly for those who are pursuing, a future in the culinary arts. So that's where we're going to go today. So first off, I just want to let you guys all know that, we're still obviously in COVID times here. And so I'm going to be bouncing between two different cameras. So just want to give you kind of an idea of what the other angle will be like here. So I will go between camera one and camera two. So I appreciate you kind of following along. No, it's not perfect. I would, of course, prefer to be doing this in person, but here we are, and so it goes. So first up, I want to talk about the two different types of knives that we usually see within a professional kitchen, what you're looking for with them, and then some different aspects as far as sharpening and keeping these types of knives in good shape. So the first knife that I'm going to show you today, this is one of our stamp knives. So for most of your kitchens, this is probably going to look familiar, something this similar weight, shape, profile. These knives tend to be a little bit thinner and lighter than some of the heavier knives, the chef's knives that are out there. They tend to feature a plastic or a hybrid handle. In this particular case, our Mercer Millennia line is a two-piece handle. It features a high carbon Japanese steel blade. But in general, these stamp knives are lower cost, again, a little bit thinner and lighter than some of the heavier duty cutlery out there. And so they may need to be cared for a little bit more often than some of the other ones that exist. The other type of knife that I'm going to show you today is what is known as a forged knife. So the Millennia was a stamped knife. The forged knives are thicker, heavier blades. They tend to be made from a higher grade of steel. In this particular case, we're working with a German stainless steel in this case. So these knives are a higher cost, higher quality, but both knives will serve you very well in a professional kitchen. So we'll talk a little bit about both of those knives, what makes them special, and how we take care of them. And then we're also going to talk about some of the different sharpening techniques today. So I want to make sure that you're all aware of the difference between honing and sharpening. And so those are really important techniques that we actually use to keep our knives sharp. And different tools do things different ways. So the first technique that we'll cover is the actual process of honing our knives. And we'll use a tool like this, which is known as a honing steel or a honing rod, to actually hone or align the edge of your knife blades. The other tools that we'll use, the sharpening tools, will be used for sharpening. And we talk about the difference between honing versus sharpening. It's a difference between realigning the knife edge and then actually grinding down steel to expose a fresh edge. So when we talk about the sharpening process, we'll use different tools. Some of these will probably look familiar to you. So one of the items that we're going to show today is a sharpening stone. So this is a manual tool. And then I also want to show you some of the other tools that exist out there, like a manual pull-through sharpener, and then a very heavy-duty electric sharpener, which we also manufacture. So you get an idea. This is something you may have seen something like this in the kitchen. If you have a kitchen that has a tri-stone in it, that would be a different version of the whetstone or the sharpening stone. So I really want to cover the dynamics of all those things today. Gives you some good ideas on that, and then make sure that if you have any questions, of course, feel free to ask them in the chat box and go along. So first off, before we actually start the techniques and answering questions about sharpening itself, what makes these knives different? What makes them special? What would be the particular applications for them either? So first off, as I mentioned, the stamp knife, these are very common in most kitchens. Lower cost, lighter weight. These are perfect learning tools. In this case, ours come in a wide variety of colors. So we make everything from all black and then different colors, the black and white, black and red, etc. And these really do well for learning tools. They're not heavy, they're nice and sharp, and they're very well priced. So it's a great knife to consider if you're looking to restock your kitchen. You have some good pieces for that. And then the other one that we have, as I showed you before, is the forge knife. High carbon German stainless steel, really good construction. These will last a very long time. So if you purchase them, it's a good investment in your classroom. So both knives can be sharpened in a similar fashion. And the Millennium knives, because it's a little lower cost, it's a lighter grade steel, it will need to be sharpened and cared for a little bit more regularly just because the material itself is a little bit softer. And so that's what sets a lot of the cutlery, different grades of cutlery apart, is the actual hardness of the material. So in general, the harder the steel, the longer the edge will last. And to get a harder steel, it's usually a higher grade, a higher quality alloy, and those knives tend to cost more. So in general, you can find good quality cutlery for good prices, but just understanding that in general, when it comes to knives, lower cost knives will most likely need to be cared for more often on a regular basis, just because the steel is a little bit lower grade. It's softer, it will lose its edge a little bit faster, and it is something that you're going to need to care for more often. So there's nothing wrong with purchasing lower cost knives. You don't need to go out and buy $150 knives for your kitchens, but just understanding that everything has a price, of course, and if you buy lower cost pieces, they certainly will function very well for your kitchen, especially if you purchase Mercer items. But just be aware that you need to be a little bit more on top of your sharpening, blade maintenance, those sort of things, because they will require more regular care. Now, when I talk about regular care, I kind of want to give you a graphic to illustrate what I'm talking about with that. So allow me a second here. I want to share my screen so you all can see what I'm talking about. So let me just pop this up here. Give me a second. I believe this should be showing. Can Nasco confirm that you see the graphic that I have up on screen?
Yes, it looks great.
Perfect. All right. So good. So thank you. So when we talk about a knife getting dull, there's a few different factors at play. So in the top left corner, that is a sharp knife. That's a knife straight out of the box. And what you notice is that the edge comes to this sort of perfect peaker point. That is optimal for cutting or slicing. That is the goal that we're looking for. I'll actually drop a math equation into the chat box before we end the conversation tonight. There is a math equation that helps sort of understand sharpness. It is the mathematical equation for force or output, and that essentially, or cutting output is essentially force over area. So if you imagine that you're pushing down on a surface with a certain amount of force, and that is divided by the area that you're cutting it over. So the idea is that the smaller the cutting area, that is to say the sharper and finer that knife's edge is, the better and more stronger output you'll get. So imagine, just for argument's sake, if we have a knife that's very dull and say it has a cutting surface of 1, 5 divided by 1 would be 5. But if our knife is very, very sharp and has a cutting edge of 0.1, say the surface area is 0.1, then the output would be 50, right? 5 divided by 0.1 would be 50. So that's the idea is that sharper and finer that edge is, the stronger and sharper our knife will be because of that basic equation. Again, I'll drop that in the chat box here at the end, but I just to kind of get an idea of what we're talking about with that. So when we're using a knife, cutting, slicing, chopping, what tends to happen is that second graphic you see there, so the middle one on the top, is that edge tends to roll over. It gets dull. It's not as straight as it should be. And so when that happens, that's when we need to get out our honing steel. What the honing steel is going to do is it is going to realign that edge, straighten it back out. But we can also see what that edge happens is as you re-hone or realign that edge, the blade itself is getting a little bit wider. So over time, we're going to need to reprofile that as we continue to wear down that steel. That takes us down to the bottom left-hand graphic you can see there, where the blade continues to dull as it rounds over from long periods of use. And then so it leads us to the bottom middle one, whereas you can kind of tell we hone again, the edge gets a little bit wider, and so on. So then we get to the point where the blade is so wide that honing won't help us anymore because the edge is essentially almost smooth, like the top of a dome, where you couldn't actually reprofile it because it's smooth all the way over. So when that happens, that's when we need to use our actual sharpening tool, which will actually grind or polish, that is to say, remove steel from the surface of the blade to expose a fresh edge. So this graphic shows the continuum of sharpening, why we use a honing steel on a regular basis, but then why after a while, the actual process of sharpening, grinding or polishing is necessary. So I want everybody to understand that is that these two terms get used interchangeably a lot, but they are different. They signify different things, different forces acting on the blade. For your day-to-day, it's not the end of the world if someone says, I want to sharpen the knife, you understand what they mean. But in general technical terms, the difference between honing or realigning the blade edge is different from grinding or polishing or sharpening because we're doing different things to the knife. So it's important to understand that as we go through this process. I also want to bring your attention to briefly, and I won't go through this whole thing, but I just want you all to know that everything we talk about today, I know this presentation is recorded, but we've also generated a really nice handout that will cover in detail everything that I'm going to describe to you. So feel free to use both resources together, but know that if you miss something, A, don't stress out about it because this is recorded, and B, know that your students, we do have a good graphic that we've made available to Nasco that they can easily share with everyone so that you can refresh this and teach your students as often as you'd like. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen, stop showing graphics. I know you're all here. You want to see how we actually get into the process of honing and sharpening our knives. So I'm going to flip over cameras here, and I'm going to walk you through the process of how we do that. So I'm just going to grab my items here. As I mentioned, we use the honing steel to do this process. And so there are different types of steels out there. The most common one that you'll find is the round steel. So it tends to be a round shape. It usually has fine grooves into it. It usually has a fairly heavy handle. It's a relatively heavy item. And so those are pretty common in most kitchens. I have two different ones that aren't quite as common, but are also very effective honing rods. So the first one I have here, this is actually a diamond steel. So this is a really cool tool. This is very useful in a kitchen. This actually will do two things at once. So it is a honing rod insofar that we will be reprofiling the blade, realigning that blade edge. But because it also has a diamond coating on it, it will actually act as a fine abrasive. So this will actually reprofile your blade to a slight degree. So you're kind of killing two birds with one stone here because you are polishing and honing at the same time. So this is a great tool if you're looking to get a hybrid item to be able to have in your kitchens. It is, again, an abrasive item, so it is removing steel from the knives, so it requires some care, but it is a really, really useful tool. The other one that I have here, this is actually ceramic. So I use this in my home kitchen all the time. This will do a really, really good job of reprofiling a knife edge as well. The main advantage of this tool is that it is harder than the steel itself. So it will reprofile the blade with fewer strokes and less edge wear on the knife itself. So that wider angle, this will occur at a lower rate than you would get with a normal steel, which is about the same hardness as the steel itself. So both of these will do a good job, but I just want to show you two alternatives to the usual German steel or steel that you see out there with some other items. So just keep these in mind as far as items that you're looking to purchase. Now, the technique itself, this is really important. Learning how to do this correctly. I'm sure if you're a cooking show aficionado, you've seen, some chefs that go 90 miles an hour with this thing on the cutting board, which, makes for great television. But the reality is that, you want to do this correctly. And more importantly, we want to teach the students how to do it right themselves. So rather than holding the steel out in front of you and going backwards or, reversing the knife along the blade of the steel, I've got a different technique that I've worked on over the last few years that I think really inspires a lot of confidence in students, and you develop the technique quickly, accurately, and with minimal, having to teach them over and over again. So the way that I teach it is I essentially will have the students get a cutting board out, get a towel down on top of the cutting board, and then hold the steel at a 90-degree angle, perpendicular to the cutting board, all right? I do this for a few reasons. Number one, I do it for safety. Safety is paramount in our kitchens. That's why I'm wearing cut-resistant glove as I do this. I want to make sure that everything I do is safe, so I don't have any accidents. So when you do this way, obviously if a student slips or if you slip, you're going right into the cutting board, into the towel. So there's no chance of accidents or hurting yourselves. If you're holding this out in front of you, especially if you're in a crowded classroom setting, potentially there could be an accident of a student standing next to somebody else, point at the right direction, etc. So overall, for me, the safest way to do this is, again, with the steel into the cutting board with a towel underneath it. It's also not going to slide around when you do this, so if you hold it out in front of you, it's very easy to move the steel. It takes very little force to move it out of alignment. So it's not going to slip around. And that leads me to the third point, is because we have this nice stable base, we're going to be able to keep ourselves in proper position when we have the knife on the steel itself. Now, what I'm going to show you is a technique that works really well for me and is designed for Mercer knives. So for most of the knives out there, German steel or most, Western style knives, most of the chef's knives we have in our kitchen, the blades are sharpened anywhere between a 15 and 20-degree angle. So I'm going to show you a process on how to get the knife to about a 20-degree angle for re-sharpening purposes. This is optimal for most of your cutting, slicing tasks. We could do a whole separate class talking about the different blade geometry. But for most of our Western style cuisine, that is to say, it's relying on, a lot of root vegetables, carrots, celery, onion, chopping mirepoix, etc. These are the types of knives we want to use, and those are the angles that we want to use so that we can easily process between both those harder, thicker root vegetables and then other items as well. If this was a Japanese knife class, we would have a whole different conversation, but that's because that cuisine is different. But for most of the things that we're teaching and cooking in our classrooms, a 20-degree angle is sufficient for the vast majority of our tasks. So we want to recreate that 20-degree angle as we're sharpening. Now, how do we do that? I could tell you, all right, just find a 20-degree angle on the blade, but the reality is that's something we have to do on a regular basis, so you may not be exactly sure of where to go. So I want to show you a real quick, easy way to get to where you need to be. So the first thing you want to do is you're going to set the knife up perpendicular to the steel, 90 degrees. That's pretty easy to find, right angle, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to cut that angle in half. Imagine you've got yourself a quarter circle or a quarter piece of pie, and you're going to cut that angle in half. All you're going to do is then cut that angle in half again. So if you do the math on that, you would be, if you did it perfectly right, at about 22.5 degrees, which is very close to 20 degrees and is sufficient for our needs. So the general idea on how to get this done correctly is, again, set yourself up at 90 degrees perpendicular to the steel, cut the angle in half, and cut it in half again. And that will get you pretty close to that 20-degree angle, which is what we're looking for. And again, when you put it down like that, it's a whole lot easier to see that angle. I know you can't tell because I'm standing at it from above, but you can see with the camera. If you're standing there, it's very easy to see that. If you're holding it out in front of you, you kind of got to cock your head back. It's not super clear. It's just not an easy thing. It's not as easy to find as you keep everything nice down into like this. So again, 90 degrees, halfway again, and you're set up. All right. Now from there, move the knife to the butt end or the heel of the blade. And I only have the bottom half of the camera in this thing. So if I was doing this normally, I'd be all the way at the top. That's so I want you to see it. I'm just going to use the bottom half of the steel, and I'm going to pull down and towards myself at the same time. All right. So down and towards myself at that same time. Now, one of the things I want you to notice that I'm not doing as I do this is you're not seeing any movement in my wrist, right? The blade angle isn't changing. So that's probably the most important thing you can do after you find the correct angle, is make sure that as you move down here, the wrist doesn't change. And this is what probably takes the most practice for students, is developing that muscle memory and that feel of being able to do this correctly without moving their wrist. But we want to make sure that we keep our wrists straight as we do that so that we don't change the angle. All right, so that's one side. I need to do the same thing on the other side. So in this case, I had the blank side of the blade facing up. Now I'm going to the other side of the knife and I have the logo side up. Same deal though. 90, halfway, halfway again. And same process. Down towards myself, keeping my wrist in place. Moderate pressure. I'm not pushing super hard into it. I have good control. I let the knife slide down the steel and sharpen, or and hone in this particular case. But you can hear with the diamond steel, it's grabbing the blade a little bit. So it is doing a little bit of polishing, a little bit of grinding as well to expose a fresh edge. So this knife is going to be razor sharp when I'm done with it. But just to give you some contrast, so you can see what it looks like on a different tool. This again is that ceramic rod. So this will put a really nice edge on it as well. 90, halfway, halfway again. Just like that, nice and easy. And I like to go back and forth. That way I don't have to count my strokes. So if I go, 6 or 7 on this side, but then I only go 2 or 3 on this side, the knife can develop a little bit of a fade to it. So when you cut into something, it wants to kind of curve one direction or the other, as opposed to going straight down into the food. And so that is the general technique for using the sharpening steel. If there's any questions about that process, please drop them in the chat box. But this is something that, is a really important skill to be teaching your students on a regular basis, because this is something we want to be doing basically daily. Something we can be doing even more often than that is actually using the knife, the honing steel, basically as often as needed when it comes to that. So any questions to this point?
There are a couple that appeared in the question and answer box, but like Chris said, feel free to also put them in the chat. But the 2 that were in the Q&A box, one said, does the speed of the knife movement matter?
It does not matter, but if you go faster, you have a higher tendency to lose your angle. So the biggest thing is accuracy. It's not about speed, it's about consistency with that angle. If you go faster, fine, but just like anything else, if you go faster, you might lose your angle. So it's easier to go nice and steady.
Nice. And then the other question is, can you say the difference between the ceramic and the diamond honers again?
Sure. So the diamond steel will hone your knife because of the way it's shaped. And then the finish on this, if you're able to feel this, you can feel that it's got a little bit of a grit to it. So it will hone, it will realign the knife, and it will also polish or sharpen a little bit at the same time. So it's a hybrid tool. You can do both with it. And then the ceramic rod is a much harder material. So ceramic items tend to have a higher hardness than most metals. So they're very, very strong, but obviously they're brittle. So if I drop this, it would break. But I could put potentially hundreds, if not thousands of pounds of pressure on it. It wouldn't crack or break or whatever. So it will just hone the knife, but it will remove less steel than just a plain steel would, because it is a harder material. So it'll align the edge more quickly with fewer strokes than just a regular metal item would.
Great. And so any other questions, throw them in the Q&A box, throw them in the chat, but I'll let you get back at it, Chris.
Thank you very much. All right, so moving on. So now we've honed our knives, we've aligned them, we've been using them in the classroom for some time. Let's say we got halfway through the first semester and we're noticing at this point that our knives just aren't cutting it anymore. We've got to make a bunch of mirepoix, we're making chicken soup or something, everybody's bludgeoning your carrots, your celery looks bad, the onions are rough, etc. It's time to sharpen the knives. So I've got a lot of different tools here to show you how to sharpen the knives. They all have a variety of different uses, utilities, comfort levels. They are all going to do the job of sharpening, which, as we mentioned before, is reprofiling the blade so that we have that super fine point that we talked about from before. But they all show off different levels that require different levels of skill, technique, etc. So I'm going to start from the heaviest duty on downward. So if you are at a school and you have a lot of students. If you've got, 100 kids coming in a day, you've got you've got 4 grade levels, 1 million kids, you're some giant school districts someplace, you may want to consider this. This is an electric sharpener. So this thing is powered, it has a motor, it has 3 stages, coarse, medium, and fine, and it has preset angle guides. So you can get through a lot of knives very quickly with this tool. It's designed primarily for institutions. So we have this for hospitals, stadiums, places where there are a lot of knives that need to be sharpened quickly. So if you're a large school, this might work for you as well. The big caveat with this thing is because it is electric, because these spin at a high RPM, they will take off more steel, so they will sharpen the lifespan of your knife. So you'll have to replace your tools more often. So you'll have to do the math on whether it makes sense to have one of these or not. If you need your knives sharp, so you have so many knives to sharpen all the time that you have the budget to replace them more often. But this thing is a beast, it'll get the job done. If you have a lot of tools to sharpen, you need to do so quickly. So it's fairly straightforward. You turn it on, you can hear it spinning. All right. So as I mentioned, it has 3 stages. Stage 1 is coarse, stage 2 is medium, and stage 3 is fine. These have different levels of coarseness wheels to them. So these first 2 are aluminum oxide Corundum wheels. They're very abrasive. So they'll take a good amount of steel off, they'll reprofile them. If you have knives that have been abused, if they've got any like pitting or edges on them, the first stage will really clean them up nicely, but you'll be able to see a noticeable change in the edge of the blade because it does take off a lot of steel. So again, always buyer beware on that. As far as use, they're very easy to use. Flip it on, drop the knife in, and you pull about 1 inch per second. Just like that. Now, I would love to show you all 3 stages, but for sake of my household, I have a toddler who's asleep upstairs. So you've heard what it sounds like. I'm just going to demo the other sides, but you get the general idea. So when it comes to sharpening, we go coarse, medium, and then fine. This will work for all of our sharpening tools. But the general idea is that you would drop it in and pull through, again, about 1 inch per second as you do that. So stage 2 is the same way, 1 inch per second, pull through. 1 or 2 pulls through is sufficient. And then stage 3 is a ceramic sharpening wheel. So this will actually put a nice finish on it. And one of the questions we get a lot is, can you sharpen a serrated knife on these items? Or can you sharpen a serrated knife, period? And it is clearly noted on the top of this thing that you can sharpen serrated knives in there. And you probably can't see it, but it says it is designed for serrated knives. So same idea with the 3rd stage. You would just drop it in, and it will polish it up nicely as you pull it through. So it's very easy to use. So again, if you have a lot of knives to sharpen, you need to do so quickly. You have the budget for it. This is a great item to consider. It works well. It can be cleaned. There's a cleaning item at the bottom that pulls all the metal fines out of it. It's nice and sturdy. It comes with rubber feet. So it's a good option for those who need a lot of knives to sharpen quickly. Now, if you don't necessarily want to buy that item or you don't feel you have a need for it, but you also don't have a lot of technique with manually sharpening your knives, I do have a really nice tool for an in-between. It's a good hybrid. So this is our double diamond. This is a manual pull-through sharpener. It has 2 stages, coarse and fine. It's the same idea as the other ones. So the coarse one is stage 1, the fine is stage 2. This is, again, an aluminum oxidized medium grit wheel. So you pull through, it spins, it polishes as you work through. And then this is a ceramic coated one, and it pulls through and it works really nice as well. So same idea, drop it in, pull it in, pull it through, 2 or 3 passes, and you have good edge on your blade. And then you move over to the fine side. You can hear the difference between the 2, the finer edge. We'll polish that knife so it's nice and sharp as you're using it. I like to go one direction with these, and you can see the knife edge is looking really good. So we're in good shape with this tool. So these are really easy to use. So again, if you don't have a lot of technique or skill, and you want something that's easy for your students to learn with, highly recommend both of these items. They're both very well priced for the quality that they are. It's great items to have in the kitchen. This, it has a hollow handle, so you could potentially draw a line in this one if you wanted to. So you could put it on a chain, have in the kitchen. If not, it could sit in your desk. It's got rubber feet on the bottom as well, so it's secure, it's not going anywhere, and it's a good tool. Now, both of those are fine, but if we really want to give our students the best training, then we want to use a tool like this. This is a sharpening stone. So this is completely manual. We are in control when we do this. So we need to understand the technique that goes into it and be understanding that anything that we do will affect the sharpness of the blade. So the way that these work is these have different levels of coarseness or grain to them. So the first thing you bring your attention to is the numbers. So this is our coarse and medium stone. So 400 and 1000. 400 is the coarse side, 1000 is the medium side. It's the same idea as sandpaper. So the lower the number, the coarser the material. And so we sell these with two different stones, again, coarse medium. And then we also have a medium fine. And so this is a 1000, 3000 grit stone that we manufacture as well. So it's great to have both in the kitchen. But if you're only going to get one, this is a good one to get because you can put a nice polish on your edge when you're doing it. So the process of using these stones, these are water stones. So got them soaking in water when I use them. So then I want to continue to add water to them. If you're using them in a kitchen, it's always good to have a towel down underneath so it doesn't make a big mess. So I actually want to show off one of our kind of new cool products. So this is a towel that we started manufacturing last year. It comes to you in a little 2-inch puck. You drop it in water and it immediately unrolls into a 9 by 23-inch towel. So, I just wanted to share there's a lot of cool innovation out there in food service, and this is something that we do that we're really proud of. So quickly unrolls, and what you get is a 100% cotton towel. It's very absorbent, and because it is 100% cotton, it can be composted or recycled when you're done with it, and it will biodegrade in the landfill. So it's a cool, neat product from us. But anyway, we want to keep the stone on a nice surface here. And then, get this camera just right, sorry. So you guys can see it. We want to make sure that we have really good technique doing this. Now, as you may recall, a few minutes ago, I talked to you about the honing technique we use on the honing steel. Part of why I really emphasize getting that right is that the technique for using the honing steel is the same technique as using the sharpening stone. So the same idea, whereas we'd get ourselves in that 90-degree angle, halfway, halfway again. So if you're able to master that skill, develop that muscle memory, then it translates directly into using a sharpened stone as well. So when we use the sharpening stone, we want to make sure that it's coated in water, so it's got a nice smooth surface. Again, I've soaked this in water for a few minutes, for 4 or 5 minutes. You should have a good surface there, but I would continue to add water to it as you work with it. Again, 90, halfway, halfway again. Start in one corner. So if you can imagine here, I'm going to start in this corner, and I'm going to work my way all the way to the other end of the sharpening stone. So again, 90, halfway, halfway again, corner to corner. So the goal when I do this is I want to use the whole length of the sharpening stone, sharpen the whole length of the knife. And the reason that I want to do that is if anybody's worked in a professional kitchen here, if you've ever had like house water stones or house sharpening stones, what tends to happen is the cooks tend to hang out like right here in the middle, and it turns into like a skateboard half pipe over time, and it reduces the lifetime of the product. So you want to get the most out of your money. You want to make sure that when you use the sharpening stone, you're encouraging your students and you're encouraging doing it yourself to make sure you use the full length of the stone to sharpen the full length of the knife. That way you'll minimize wear in any one place, and you'll get maximum functionality out of your tool, out of your product. All right. So 4 or 5 strokes on one side, and then I need to do the other side of the knife. So again, I did the logo side up first, and now I need to do the other side as well, the plain side up. So again, same idea, 90, halfway, halfway again, and then bring the knife the other direction. And again, making sure that I use the whole length of the knife to do the whole length of the stone. All right. Now, there are many different techniques for doing this. So don't think that what you're seeing today is the only way to do this. You could fall down a YouTube rabbit hole and see a lot of chefs doing a lot of different ways. But the one thing that you'll see all of those chefs and professional knife sharpeners do, no matter where they're from, what they do with their knives, is they will always maintain a uniform angle across the blades. So whether they go forwards, whether they go backwards, there's merit for both directions. I'm certainly not in a position to tell you what's best. The biggest thing is your knives come out sharp when you're done, and the blade is not being worn down too quickly. And so that's really what sharpening by hand allows us to do, is because we are controlling the guided angle, we are removing the least amount of steel as possible from the blade, giving us the sharpest knife with the least amount of wear, so that our knife will last the longest. So I've done 4 or 5 strokes on one side, 4 or 5 strokes on the other side. I will then continue to progress across the stone, moving on now to the medium side. I'll demo a different technique so you can see it. In this case, I'm going to hold the knife, the stone perpendicular to me, and I'm going to do the exact same thing moving across the surface of the stone. Now, what's a little bit different, again, this is just personal preference for me, is then I can switch hands and do the other side of the blade. Now, if you're not comfortable with this, familiar with this, you may have some trouble with this, but in that case, then I would just go this way, and then I would come right back the other direction, just like that. So there's a lot of different ways that you can get this done. And then if we wanted to continue with the full sharpening gamut, I would then put it on the 3000 grit side and really get a razor sharp edge on this knife, and continuing to add water to it as I go along. So that is the process, and that is the same process for both of our knives. So again, this is the nicer, more expensive German forge knife, but if I'm going to do this with the less expensive stamped blade, it's exactly the same, and you can really get the same edge on there because these knives are both good quality steel. So there's no issue with getting, for lack of a better term, a lightsaber out of both of these knives. They will accept the edge. The biggest thing, again, is to find that 15 to 20 degree angle. Maintain that uniform angle across the full length of the blade, and you will get a really good result. It takes some practice. So this is a skill that definitely takes some practice to doing. But if you have students who are really interested in this, I encourage you to have them work with the stone or the honing steel on a regular basis, and they can develop that muscle memory, and then have them practice with the sharpening stone so they can really develop their skills. Again, there's a lot of resources online. I also included that resource that Nasco can send to you to do that. But there is a tool that can help you with this process. So this is something I forgot to get myself one for our conversation today, but I just want to show you a product that does exist to kind of make your life a little bit easier. So this is something that is on the Nasco website, just to understand that. So this is essentially an edge guide. So what this does is it clips onto the back of the knife, and it acts as training wheels of sorts. So it will give you, it has kind of a rectangular wedge shape to it. So you clip that on there, and that is a good learning tool as well. So just so you're aware, there are some tools out there to help you with this process. Whether you need it or not is certainly up to you, but just be aware that there is something that does exist. So that is more or less what I have to present. Like I said, I'll punch that formula here into the chat in a second, but I would love to answer questions you have. And if anybody wants me to go slower, go back to demoing anything or whatever, just let me know. I know we have plenty of time left, so I'm not in a hurry to get anywhere. So let me know.
Well, thank you so much, Chris. It's as Lisa just put in the chat, that's really cool. So we really appreciate you sharing all those techniques.
Sure.
A couple other questions did come in the Q&A box, but by all means, please do throw things in the chat or throw things, in that Q&A box as well. And we're happy to talk through them. So one of the questions that came in when you're working with the stone was, should you always have your knife wet when sharpening?
Yeah, I mean, in general, you want there to be some kind of liquid along the edge of the stone, some kind of lubricant to do that. If you don't, it can scratch the edge of the knife because, as we said, we're grinding or polishing steel off of there. So there is little metal filings. I know it, I want to put the knife on the edge of the camera, but you might be able to see it there's a little bit of, looks like grime on the edge of the knife, and that is a really thin film of steel or metal that's come off. So if you don't have that, that can grind against the steel, the blade edge, it can scratch up the knife, and that can damage it. So some kind of liquid is key. With these, water is what we recommend. If you have a different stone in your classroom that has used oil in the past, certainly continue to use oil, but I highly recommend some kind of liquid, water or honing oil when you use a sharpening stone.
Excellent. And then the other question that I have is, what are the signs that a knife is dull, and when do you know when to sharpen versus when to rebuy?
Sure. So just about any knife can be resharpened. If a knife is super rusted or corroded, and you don't feel like taking the time to scrub it and get it looking all nice and new, then certainly buy a new one. Knives aren't particularly expensive. So when you can tell a knife is dull is there's a number of things. An onion, a lot of people tell you a tomato test is a good way of telling, but honestly, like, your knife needs to be really, really sharp to make good work of a tomato. So I would tell you a better example for most classrooms is an onion. If you try to cut and dice an onion and it's really, really hard to get through, if you can't get clean, sharp slices through an onion, I would start with honing and then move on to sharpening with that. And unless the blade has been, severely mistreated, it most likely can be polished and sharpened to at least a certain degree. But, for most of our classroom work, carrots, onions, celery, these are the hardest things that you'd be cutting into. So if your knives can easily slice through those, then you're in pretty good shape.
Wonderful. And we did have one more question come in as you were talking, and that was, this might be a silly question, but do you always wear the glove, and is it hot?
Is the glove hot? I mean, not so much. This is this is a new product for us. So this is a form-fitting glove. It's got some spandex built into it, so it fits snugly. But I mean, it's not super uncomfortable, super hot. I don't always wear the glove personally. I have a lot of experience in the kitchen. But if you have students who you're concerned about them hurting themselves while they're using knives, this is a very good tool to invest in. So these don't really cost a lot of money. I would certainly budget for them because they're way cheaper than losing a student to, a week or two out of classroom because they have to get stitches. And then, not that you're necessarily in the industry itself, but if you're in an operation where somebody cuts themselves, it could potentially cost a lot in disability and lost wages, work time, etc. So I think it's a good idea. If somebody shows that they have proficiency in knife skills, you can leave it up to them. But I think while someone's learning, especially if they're trepidatious about using a knife, it's a good idea to have one on.
Excellent. Well, those are all the questions that I had pop in. I see that. Thank you, Chris, for putting the equation in the chat box. And if there are any other questions, now is a great time to type them in. Otherwise, I will be emailing out the recording. I'll be emailing out the handouts for today. And if you have any questions that pop into your mind as you're reviewing any of those things, email them to me, and I'll be sure to get them to Chris, and I'm sure he would be happy to answer any of those questions as they come in. So, Chris, thank you so much for your time.
Of course.
And for the great demos that we had today. And thank everyone for tuning in, for watching the recording. We look forward to returning with our FCS series and continuing to provide this professional development opportunity for our FCS classrooms across the nation. And I hope you all have a wonderful night.
Thanks everybody for joining us. I appreciate your time tonight.